Good afternoon to everyone. We're starting one more edition of our webinar cycle on consequences of COVID-19. We are very happy to receive today Professor Guy Peters, who will share with us this webinar about governing in a crisis. We are going to have also Professor Fernando Filgueiras, who is also a professor here at the Public Policies and Government Department of Fundação Getulio Vargas. We also have Dean Edson Kondo, who is going to share a few words with us today. Professor Edson, please. You have to open your microphone.
Sorry for that. Thank you, Graziella. Thank you, Professor Guy Peters. We are again talking here from Brazil at the School of Public Policy and Government of Getulio Vargas Foundation. We have today the great pleasure of welcoming Professor Guy Peters, talking about the major challenges every country is facing in these times, which is governing in times of crisis. Professor Peters, thank you so much for giving us the privilege of having you here. And we hope that very soon we can be able to welcome you in person here in Brazil at our school. So without further ado, let me get back to you, Graziella, for introduction and starting right away. Again, well, thank you very much.
Professor Guy Peters don't actually need an introduction, but I'll do it anyway. He's the Morris Falk Professor of American Government in the University of Pittsburgh. And more recently, I'm not going to say all his curriculum, we're going to stay all night here, but more recently, he has published the Multi-Level Governance, Institutional Theory in Political Science, the New Institutionalism, and Governance, Politics, and the State. We are very, very happy and very, very honored to receive Professor Guy Peters. Please, Professor.
Okay, thank you, Graziella. Thank you, Professor Kondo. It's a pleasure for me to be able to talk to you this afternoon about governing in a time of crisis. So I'm going to turn on the screen share so we can see the slides that I've got here, if I can find them. Where are they? Hold on here. Okay, now. Sorry, I'm trying to find I don't know where there we are. Okay, now, so I'm supposed to talk this afternoon about governing in a time of crisis, and the subtitle that I've got for this presentation is The Good, the Bad, and the Merely Normal. So, we're in the midst, it's hard to miss the fact that we're in the midst of a crisis or numerous crises. Obviously, the big one we talk about mostly is COVID-19, the virus. But with that, it's also come a second crisis of economic decline, and in some cases, massive economic disruption, with millions of people in the United States now being unemployed, and numerous businesses on the verge of going bankrupt or already having gone bankrupt. And also that has emphasized problems about racial equality and inclusiveness in the society more generally. So the virus and its manifestations have made it much more clear how separate, how uninclusive many of our societies are, and how this is causing its own set of difficulties. So this is a not so perfect storm, bringing together multiple crises all together at once, with governments having to cope with these and trying to govern. Now, all these crises going together should affect governance, and have, as I'll try to point out in a few moments. We should expect some major changes in governance, and some indeed have occurred. But I think it's important not to get carried away with crisis. And as I'll try to point out toward the end, a lot of what we're seeing in governance is really not that much different from what we see in normal governance. The speed is accelerated, the intensity is accelerated, but some of the same issues, some of the same processes of governing go along and are very similar. And it's especially important to remove ourselves from total doom and gloom. It's easy to get depressed. It's easy to get despondent about what's happening and to have to try to adapt to a totally different world. But at the same time, there may even be some good that emerges from trying to cope with the crises. Now, what is important to think about too is what governance is. We use the term all the time. This is governance. But as I'm using governance, using it in a very general way, governance is about steering the economy and the society toward collective goals. And those goals are hopefully set through a democratic process. Needn't be, but hopefully they're set through a democratic process. And the way in which we do that steering is public policy. So when we're talking about governance, we are in many ways talking about making and implementing public policy. Those are the instruments we use to try to steer. And therefore, governance and policy go hand in hand. And a lot of what I'll talk about today then really has a very strong component about policy making and the policy process, as well as about governance per se. So let me begin with the doom and gloom. Let me begin with the bad stuff that's happening as a reaction to the current crises. So the one politically, I think the thing that's perhaps the most obvious is that the crisis and the crises, I should say, have opened the door for extremists. Okay, this has been true historically as well. So if one looks at the rise of Hitler, for example, to some extent, his rise was facilitated by the problems in Germany following the end of the First World War, the collapse of the Weimar Republic, massive inflation. So another type of crisis then produced the grounds that produced a dictatorship. And in numerous contemporary cases, extremists are using the crisis as an excuse to try to either further their power or to gain power. And the current crisis, and again, all crises, tend to be conducive to illiberal authoritarian figures. And it's fairly easy to understand this. Crises demand action. The people want action and are willing to sweep away some of the restraints that we're used to in a democratic process or even in quasi-democratic processes in order to get action to try to address the problems, the very real problems that we all face. So it's not surprising then that crisis produces the opportunity for less than fully democratic leaders to be successful, and to a nation begins at times to try to become perhaps too invasive and to attack some of the notions of academic freedom, but that's my own personal problem. Okay, now, the second part of the bad, or another part of the bad, I should say, is that crises have undermined important institutions in society and globally. So in the World Health Organization has been to some extent undermined, has made a few poor decisions, has made some mistakes, and it's less trusted than it once was, perhaps, not just by President Trump, but by other people as well. And within the United States, the Communicable Disease Center, or actually now the Center for Disease Control, which was historically one of the most respected institutions in the federal government, now is become more suspect, is having a crisis of its own, as it wasn't prepared for what was going to happen. Okay. And also, the crisis changes important institutions. Not this crisis, but the last big one, the Great Recession, beginning in 2007, going into roughly 2011. Change, for example, central banks. And again, speaking from an American example, the Federal Reserve Bank, which historically had been very independent of political leadership, had always made its own decisions about economic policy based on good, solid economic principles, became more politicized. And even now, is still more politicized than it has been historically. So was undermined by the crisis and the need for action. And then finally, in the bad, and those of you listening probably can come up with some other negative consequences of the crises. The crises have fostered nationalism, border controls going up in countries that had not recently been very interested in strict controls on their borders, even within the European Union, where one is supposed to be able to travel without border controls. Today, you have border controls even going from Germany to Austria or Germany to Denmark. So you have these, again, nationalism. We protect ourselves, we keep out foreigners, and presumably the foreigners are the vectors for the disease, rather than looking at our own problems internally. So enough on that, but there's all these, there's these bad things that have been occurring in terms of governance, point to several interesting paradoxes. The first is that the public expects prompt, effective action from the same government that they complain about the rest of the time. So I don't know, I think Brazilians may be more accepting of their government than Americans are. But most Americans complain about government all the time, except when there's a crisis. And then they want that same government to be effective, efficient, and produce prompt and decisive action. So there's a real paradox here in terms of the way in which we view government. And the crises really make these more apparent. Likewise, the very institutions and actors that are most capable of addressing the problems may be undermined. Again, the Centers for Disease Control in the US as an example. And then finally, crises come one after another, but they're never expected. So we know that we're going to have another crisis after this and one after that. But somehow they always seem to be a surprise. And we never are quite ready. And in this case, we were ready. Interestingly, the Obama administration had stockpiled a lot of equipment, masks, et cetera, which were allowed to deteriorate over the last 4 years so that we weren't really ready. But we never seemed to be able to prepare enough for the next crisis. And now the good. So it seems perhaps odd or even unacceptable to talk about the good that may come out of this crisis or any crisis, but there can be some. In the first place, and perhaps most importantly, crises open the door for innovation. So when you need things done, you become more willing to innovate. You become more willing to look at, if not necessarily accept, good new ideas. This was true historically. The beginnings of the welfare state came after the First World War in Europe and after the Depression in the United States and elsewhere. So a major world crises produced the mixed economy welfare state. The Great Recession, again, beginning 2007, altered the way in which public finance worked and opened the door for new instruments for economic policy, particularly quantitative easing, or the use of central banks buying up private debt as well as public debt. And the current crisis is opening ways for change also. One is that no one in the US now is quite as skeptical about public health care as we were 4 months ago. So this may in fact be the opening to getting a truly national healthcare system. And a number of countries in Europe have adopted things that are very close to a guaranteed income for their citizens. 90%, 80% of the wage before the crisis. Again, opening up new avenues for social and economic policy, as well as the health policies. And the crises can reinvigorate old institutions. Again, one of the most important, again, in an American sense, has been federalism. So federalism in the US has to some extent been our savior. Had it not been for governors like Cuomo in New York and Tom Wolf in Pennsylvania and Gavin Newsom in California, we'd be in a lot worse state than we are now. So when the federal government was incapable of acting, then the states took over and did the job. Now, imperfectly, but they have done a much better job than the federal government. And people see now the utility of having state governments. And the crises also expose poorly functioning institutions. The British historian Neil Ferguson wrote the wonderful book called The Audit of War, arguing that war as a crisis really exposes weaknesses in societies. And the wisdom of old policies become apparent. So the need to focus on public health measures as opposed to strictly curative medicine. During crisis, the public is more compliant. They'll do what needs to be done. And sometimes they're willing to make incredible sacrifices. Certainly the medical professions and the first responders have made great personal sacrifices to deal with the crisis. So it has also, to some extent, brought out community, not just government in the formal sense, but it's brought out, to some extent, the value of community and the processes of community. And then finally, a lot of governing in crisis is merely normal. So a lot of governance is still business as usual. The time frame may be accelerated, but to some extent it's the same. And arguably, governance may even be easier in crisis than it is outside of crisis. In the first place, we know what the problem is. There's no doubt that we can identify what the problem on everyone's mind is this afternoon in governing, or the problems, I should say now, with the virus and with the economy. And there's no doubt that these issues are on the agenda. There's no question that government has accepted them as something that has to be dealt with. And likewise, there's more latitude for action. Now, I've already said that there's perhaps too much latitude for action, and that some political leaders may use this as an excuse to enhance their own political power. But at least governments have the latitude to act to try to address the problems. And some other important points of normality in governing. One that we often forget, which is important, particularly now, is that a lot of policy making is experimentation, particularly when we're dealing with social, economic, and health policies. We don't have guaranteed technologies. So we are experimenting. Now, we don't have to go so far in experimenting as to swallow bleach, as one political leader has suggested. But the crises make it more apparent. Also, the crises make it more apparent that policy making is complex, and there are a lot of linkages among policies. So, a health problem creates an economic problem. The economic problem exacerbates underlying social problems. So all these things are linked. So we can't deal with a single problem at once and for all. We have to look at the linkages. We have to look at these complex, wicked problems that affect us all. Okay, and also success is difficult to define in crisis and not in crisis. So our president said that if we could keep the deaths in the US to 100,000 from the virus, that would be a great success. Now, most people couldn't accept that, particularly if their families were ones affected by the 100,000. But defining what success is for policies and for governance is often difficult. Also, bureaucratic politics goes on pretty much as it has during time, quote unquote, normal times. So again, using the American example, the Communicable Center for Disease Control is fighting the White House. The White House is fighting the National Institutes of Health. The National Institutes of Health are fighting the Department of Health and Human Services, and on and on and on. So everybody is using the crisis as a means of enhancing their own political power and their own budgets, et cetera, just as they would during normal times. And then finally, the national borders are irrelevant for most important crises and most important policies. Climate change, the virus, poverty, hunger, all go across borders. And some will go across borders perhaps more easily. But national borders then aren't a particularly useful term for dealing with important policy issues. So we're dealing with wicked and complex problems in the best of times, but particularly perhaps in times of crisis. Now, the COVID virus itself is not a particularly wicked or complex problem. Okay, we can identify it. We know when people get sick. We know when they get well. We know the causes, whereas the usual definitions of wicked problems are the difficulty in identifying difficult, and then race and inequality, which have come up as a part of the wickedness in the problem areas, have always been and will continue to be wicked, very difficult problems to solve. So in summary, governance is always a challenge. In the best of times, governance is a challenge. Crisis may not make it any easier, but at the same time, crisis can break down barriers to change. So we may be able to produce, in the long run, better patterns of governance once we live through the crisis. Now, it's obviously difficult to be optimistic now, but hopefully this is perhaps just a little bit of hope. So I thank you for your attention. I was told to keep it to about 20, 25 minutes. I think I have, but there's so much more to talk about. So I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Peters. By now, I would like to inform our audience that if you want to send questions, you could just click on the link here in the YouTube description, and you can send the question by the platform Slido, as you can see. So we are going to have a few questions from Fernando and my questions, and after that, we are going to read the questions from the audience. So Professor Fernando Filgueiras, please start.
Okay, thank you, Graziella. Thank you, Professor Guy. My question is not a simple question, but
I didn't expect it would be.
Yeah, okay. Different capacities of the state imply different solutions to problems of collective action. For example, policy networks can play a central role in crisis management, but it depends on the ability of governments to engage different actors. More hierarchical relations, on the other hand, depending on an even greater capacity of the state. In all these solutions, we have the coordination problem. In crisis situations, problems of collective action emerge more strongly. How to solve these coordination problems in crisis situations? What is the role of political authority?
Okay, if I knew the answer to that question, Anyway, no, but it's a good question, very good question. Thank you. Again, this is again part of the normal. We always have coordination problems in government. Now, the crises perhaps make them more apparent, make them easier to see. But at the same time, they also may make them easier to solve. That is, the actors involved may be more willing to accept hierarchical control in times of crisis. So I mean, it's the argument usually is that there are three means of solving coordination problems, or three means of governing: hierarchy, markets, and networks. Now, so everything else being equal in crisis, governments tend to resort to hierarchy. That's their first response, is to use command and control from the center. But I think what we've seen to some extent, particularly for dealing with the health crisis, is how much the networks can work, so that the health system is a very rich and well-connected network. So these people are used to working with one another during normal times. And it's been remarkable, in fact, particularly I think in New York City. Again, I'm sorry for all the American examples, but it's easier for me to deal with those. How well that the health network mobilized on its own to deal with problems of coordination, to deal with how do you deal with ambulances? How do you get people to the hospital? How do you deal with internal management of the hospital, clearing out people who don't need care or immediate care, so forth. So the networks in some ways took over and have become very powerful, and have become more powerful because of that. And same way, I think, in economic crises, again, not so much, I think, in the current one, but back in the Great Recession in 2007, 8, and so forth, the underlying economic and political networks there really did work to a great extent to try and address the problems, perhaps more effectively than hierarchical governance. Markets as a mechanism, not so well, but the hierarchy and networks, I think, have been able to at least address part of the problem. Now, none of this is perfect, but it's never perfect in the best of times. And the other thing that's important too in this is yet sort of a fourth method of coordination, what Jean Bardak and Shannon Ryan talked about as reframing. That is, trying to take a problem and frame it in each other's language so that we can agree upon what the problem is, and therefore we have a better chance of agreeing about how to solve it. Now, in a crisis, that tends to be much less difficult. We can agree that there's a problem of a coronavirus that's producing death at alarming numbers. So we can agree upon what the problem is. We may not agree upon how to solve it, but at least we have the foundation of what the problem is. Okay?
Great, thank you. I'm going to take a ride in Fernando's question, because we have a question from the audience that actually not from the audience before, they sent a question before, and it's related to the actors that influence on the policy. So I think we may take this thing and go for it.
Okay.
The question is from Edward Maya from Fiocruz.
I know, he's in Pittsburgh right now.
Oh, okay. So he could just ask directly.
Right.
He asked, do you comprehend that social participation matters for governance in a context of COVID-19 crisis? And how would be a proper arrangement for doing so?
Okay, I think to some extent, when I was dealing with Fernando's question, I was answering that in part, but more about professional networks. And I think Edward is talking much more about networks or social participation of quote unquote ordinary citizens, organized or not. Now, so at one level, it's very hard to involve ordinary citizens in the current crisis. A, because you can't get them together. So if you want to have some sort of public deliberation, some sort of public forum about the problem, it's impossible now. Maybe we can do it on Zoom, but it's not quite as effective. Just like I wish I could be with you in person rather than doing this by Zoom. Anyway, so it's to some extent harder than to involve the public. Secondly, at least at the initial stage, this is a technical question. So the health professionals are much more important at the initial stage dealing with the issue than will the ordinary citizens. Now, where I think that begins to change is when we begin to move out of the crisis, when it bottoms out, when we come back to something like normalcy. So then you should be asking questions about, okay, how open do you want the economy to be? How much risk are we willing to accept as a people? Not professional risk assessment, but how much are we as people willing to risk, are we willing to accept in order to be able to have a better economy? So when those types of questions come up, when we move beyond the technical, then that's where I think the openings are for social participation.
Thank you, Professor Guy. Now, I have a question regarding, we are always talking about corruption in Brazil. I mean, it's always an issue on the public debate. I would like to hear from you about the trade-off between transparency and agility on implementation of policies. The theme of lack of transparency and corruption has been a major issue, but most of the responses to the problem will diminish the autonomy of policymakers and reduce the possibility to make things faster. If the trade-off between transparency and agility has always been a dilemma, it seems to get worse in times of crisis. So my questions are, do you think that this trade-off is still a big issue? And if so, how do you think democratic governments could act to address this issue?
Okay, another good question. Well, I think the trade-off is very real. So that, I mean, we tend to transparency is one of these ideas that we all salute almost blindly. So everybody's in favor of transparency. It's hard to be opposed to it. At the same time, it does have cost. It does it makes making good decisions more difficult. Because if you're making decisions where everybody sees who votes which way, who's arguing which way, politically it becomes difficult. So politicians find transparency difficult. They often make decisions by the lowest common denominator rather than making the best possible decisions. Now, so I think, and agility, as you're saying, making quick decisions is maybe difficult with transparency. So there's a very real trade-off. Now, so then what do we do? Well, first of all, I think, again, to figure out or, decide, and you and I can't, but I think we have to decide collectively as a society or societies, which decisions are we willing to accept as being intransparent? So there are certain types of things that national security typically is something that we would say would not be transparent in the usual sense of the term. But how far are we willing to go down how far are we willing to go on that? And to some extent, for example, even on health. So a lot of decisions that are being made on health are being made intransparently at the very bottom of healthcare systems. So who gets the ventilator and who doesn't? So I don't know if you've ever read this book by Calabresi and Bobbitt. It was written in the 1970s, and it's called Tragic Choices. And their argument was that a lot of what governments are faced with are tragic choices. That is, there are choices where somebody lives and other people die. And how do you make those choices? And their answer basically was they have to be made intransparently. So anyway, it's a wonderful book. I still use it for teaching all the time. Anyway, but so we have to make decisions about what types of decisions should be exposed to more sunlight and which types of decisions we're willing to allow to be made behind closed doors. Okay, and secondly, then, is I think trying, even if the decisions are made behind closed doors, is to question who gets to go behind the closed doors. So how do you broaden participation in those decisions so that you have a more representative sample of people, some of whom may be willing to blow the whistle on corruption and so forth. So I think both by looking at decisions and looking at institutions, we have a better chance of trying to deal with that trade-off.
Professor Fernando, do you want to address one more question?
Oh, yes, I have another question. Guy, during complex crises, multiple values are at stake simultaneously, and decisions must be mediated. How mitigate the value conflict, sparking the public controversies and blame game?
Yeah, again, politics is about claiming credit and avoiding blame. Kent Weaver famously said. And so the blame game is going to go on even in the midst of crisis. I mean, I think in any number of countries, if you look at press conferences from public officials, so forth, they're all playing the blame game. So he was trying to shift blame onto somebody else. President Trump is perhaps the master of that, but all politicians have been doing it. So I don't think we can avoid the blame game or the attempts to shift blame. But to go back to Graziella's question, at the same time that we play the blame game, we have to also think about accountability. We have to think also about, ultimately someone has to be held accountable for those decisions. Maybe not today, because again, we have to govern. We have to get these things done, but we have to find some way of understanding how the decisions were made, and particularly so they could be made better the next time. So we have to use these, always be using these as learning opportunities. And one of the things I had on my slides is that we don't expect the next crisis, but it's coming. I can't tell you what it is, but it's coming. So what can we learn from this crisis that can help us manage that next one better?
Especially the institutions and how they work it through this crisis, right?
Right.
One thing that I always, I've been thinking now, and it's about what I study, it's the informal institutions that make democracy as well. Because when we talk about institutions, most of the time we're talking about formal ones, and formal institutions are very good to study because we know how they change, we know their path. It's easier, but right. We don't know how informal institutions change, and most of the autocratic inputs are happening in this area, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, but a lot of the autocracy, some of the autocracy is happening formally as well. I mean, particularly in cases like Hungary, Poland, where you have really formal legal changes that are being done in the name of fighting COVID-19, which are fundamentally just subterfuge to enhance the power of Orban and the brothers and so forth. So anyway, yeah, but informal institutions are always crucial for understanding, and so that we have to look beneath and even look at the informal institutions within the formal institutions. So you take a legislature. there's an informal structure within that within the legislature on how people work, who has power, not necessarily for formal reasons, but for informal reasons. So we have to understand those informal structures that exist within legislatures, bureaucracies, etc., to really understand. And and also to go back to Fernando's question about coordination, that those informal connections and informal networks are often crucial for the coordination process. So if I'm in ministry X and I can call you up in ministry Y and say, look, we've got a problem. What do we do? Let's get together and have a cup of coffee. And we can solve it. So those informal networks are very functional for making the system, getting rid of a lot of the transaction costs within the systems.
I think we can have one more question for Professor Fernando, then we can bring more questions from the audience. We already have a few, so.
Okay. Guy, there are uncertainties and ambiguities regarding the duration of the pandemic crisis. How do these affect public policy governance? The time, duration of pandemic crisis and ambiguities and uncertainties?
Yeah, I mean, I think what is very different about this crisis is just how long it's been going on already. I mean, some economic crises have gone on this long, the Depression, the Great Recession. But for a health crisis or hurricane or floods or whatever, this is a very long-lived crisis. And people get tired. You and I get tired of not going out, of wearing our mask when we do go out, and so forth. So the compliance that is easy to get initially begins to wear off. So it becomes harder to govern over time. And likewise, then the effects become cumulative. So the economic effects of the virus are accumulating, and they're going to last for a very long time. So the one crisis, so even if we were found the vaccine or the cure this afternoon, the economic hangover is going to last for years. So so it's easy to declare victory and say, okay, we've solved this, but there usually is not any clear victory. I mean, again, I used to live in New Orleans, and I left before Katrina, before the big hurricane. And New Orleans is not the same now, 20 years after. Some of the parts of that crisis are still continuing. So the formal length of the crisis is perhaps only the tip of the iceberg. And we have to think about those other consequences as well.
Yeah, that's great. Professor, I'm going to read two questions in a row now from our audience. So we have Barbara Maya, who wants to know, how has the crisis affected the US electoral context? Public opinion seems more favorable to the federal government actions, or there is an emphasis on subnational government. And if I may, I'm going to address two questions. The second one is from Catarina Segato, and she wants to know, I read a recent paper that you wrote about public administration in right-wing populist governments. Has anything changed during the pandemic?
Okay, first question. I think in general, the subnational governments have come out better than has the federal government. So the state, again, I think I said when I was rattling on at the beginning, without the states' governments, and without particularly some very strong governors, we would have been in much worse states than we are. And I think many people have seen now the state governments have really been the salvation, whereas the federal government really has been very inept in dealing with the issue. Even again, organizations that everyone expected to be much more capable, like the Center for Disease Control and the National Institutes of Health, leaving aside Fauci, have really been very inept in dealing with the issues. So again, the states look better, even local governments look better. So again, in where I live in the city, the mayor has come out looking like a star, simply because he's been consistent, clear, knew what he wanted to do, shut down the place as quickly as he could, and has kept it shut down. And so we've come off better than most large cities, simply because the mayor was willing to take action. And same way with the state, with the governor of Pennsylvania, for the state. So the federal government has never been very popular with Americans. So I think people tend to like their local government the best, state government second, and the federal government third. And it's now even more so. And what was the second question? I'm sorry. I got engaged in the first one there.
The second question regards, 1 second. Here. Catarina Segato wants to know if you think the pandemic changed what you wrote about right-wing populist governments.
Right. No, I think if anything, it's made it's exaggerated what we wrote. For one thing that we wrote, and then when particularly talking about the Trump administration, but also talking about to some extent other right-wing populist governments, is that they aren't very good at working with the bureaucracy. And when you have a crisis, you need people who have experience, you need people who have expertise. And by essentially gutting the bureaucracy and getting rid of the experts, you're not left with anybody who can really give you good advice. And again, Trump is particularly egregious in this regard because the people he brings in as advisors have no real experience at all in health. So even the Secretary of Health and Human Services was a lobbyist. On and on and on. So, in part because most right-wing most populists, right or left, and the same thing would be true with AMLO in Mexico. AMLO is slightly different because he was mayor for a long time in Mexico City. But most of them don't have connections in government. They don't have experience. So they don't have a team of people whom they trust, who they can bring in with them. And they don't like the bureaucracy because that's the deep state. They're the enemy. So they're left without expertise and hence have a harder time governing. I should say that just as a preview of coming attractions, we've got a book put together now on a comparative study of how the bureaucracy has fared under various populist regimes. So hopefully it'll be out in 6 months to a year.
We are very excited to read it already.
I'm excited to try to get it out. So,
if Professor Fernando wants to move on with the follow-up question.
Yes. About the deep state, in Brazil and in the United States, we have very strong political polarization. As a result of this pandemic, economic and social problems tend to get worse. How can bureaucratic actors act on reforms that will be necessary to face the effects of the crisis?
The answer, I'm afraid, is that they can't. Because again, in most, I know less about Brazil than you do, certainly, but certainly in the US, the bureaucracy is sidelined. Trump doesn't want to deal with them. His people don't want to deal with them. So they're essentially pretty much just doing routine business. They're not thinking about reform. And in some ways, they don't need reform. I mean, the career bureaucracy is actually pretty good. More than pretty good, it's very good. And unfortunately, a lot of them are leaving government now because of the current administration. But historically, they've been very good managers and policy advisors. Now, but they're very disgruntled with the current administration. They feel like they're being, again, sidelined, neglected, and so forth. And the interesting thing, though, actually with Trump, is that unlike most presidents, whether they're populist or not, he said not word one that I can find about actually reforming the bureaucracy. He simply ignored it.
Okay, I think we can have one more question for the audience. Lincoln Veloso wants to know what is the biggest challenge that will probably happen in the field of economic and of international organizations of COVID-19, after COVID-19, and economics and international organizations after the crisis. And we also have a question from Sergio Weiler, who wants to know how to avoid targeting advantaged groups first, in spite of everybody else's issues in a time of crisis. I think it's a question regarding inequality.
Yeah.
So how to address everyone. Right.
Both are very difficult questions. So I don't know how far in the future he's talking about, or she's talking about, the economic effects. But I think, as I was saying to Fernando a moment ago, the economic effects of COVID are going to be very long-term. Not only in terms of businesses that have gone bankrupt, people who've been unemployed, but if you think about people who are graduating from high school or university in the US or in the Northern Hemisphere, so it's graduation time. So all these people now are leaving university looking for their first job. There aren't any new jobs there. So it's going to be a year or two before this crop of newly minted undergraduate students or high school students can find a job. So they're going to lose 2 years of their economic livelihood. And the bad economies particularly affected people in their 20s and 30s already. So there's going to be a lost generation economically, who won't have savings, who can't buy houses, etc. So these are going to be very long-term effects, particularly on that generation of this economic crisis. I don't dare comment about international organizations. I'll leave that one to someone else. And then the targeting question, I think, is a very good question, and it's extraordinarily difficult. Because we know that even again in normal times, the medical system, the educational system, etc., implicitly, if not explicitly, treats different people differently. So if you can walk in to see your doctor and you can speak in good, complete sentences, explain what's wrong with you, etc., you're going to be treated differently than someone who's inarticulate. Again, even if people are trying their best. And here we're dealing with scarce resources. So there's a limited number of hospital beds, ICU beds particularly, the limited number of ventilators. So now, in fairness, the evidence is that they tend to have been allocated on almost on a first come, first served basis once you get to that stage. But it's getting to that stage that may be the problem. Getting from the slum into the hospital may be difficult. The ambulance is less willing to go there. They don't have connections, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, targeting and inequality is endemic in public policy. Hopefully, again, I think at least in the U.S. with the Black Lives Matter, it's been as well as being about race, it's also been about economic inequality. It's not sung quite as not as so. At least some of that's being. I think there's some hope of it being addressed. I hope so in Brazil as well.
Okay. We have two more questions from the audience. One is from Jailson Silva, who works with us in our school. As you mentioned in paradoxes, people expected effective actions from the same government they are used to complain about all the time. How can the made or even the non-made actions of those in office now help them maintain power from themselves, putting democracies at risk?
Okay. Obviously the best thing that someone in power can do right now is to be effective. So if they can address the problem effectively, maybe not solve the problem, but at least manage it, then that's the best thing that any sitting politician can hope to do. So, but unfortunately, most of them haven't done that. I mean, you can speak about President Bolsonaro. I can speak about Trump. We can both speak about Boris Johnson. None of them have done a very good job, and on and on and on. So it's that lack of skill, I think, in political background that for many of these leaders that is really undermining their effectiveness, and ultimately it's going to undermine their capacity to stay in office.
That's great. Do you have more questions, Professor Fernando? I have two more questions. We have 4 more minutes. If
yes,
Professor
yes,
so,
I have a last question.
Professor.
Okay, Guy, there is a conceptual distinction between crisis and turbulence. Different countries globally were facing turbulence in different ways. Now, we are moving towards a real crisis situation. How do you see the democracy and quality of public policy in this context?
Oi, look into my crystal ball, okay? Now, but again, I think, I would argue that in some ways, we're looking not only at problems, we also are looking at opportunities. I think, the crises these do create windows of, if we use good old Kingdom, windows of opportunity that open up. Now, these are very painful windows to get open, but they're still windows. So, and secondly, again, hopefully we can learn. We can learn about this from this crisis. What can we do for the next one? So that's the good side. Of course, I'm afraid that the cynical answer is we'll simply go back to business as usual. We won't learn anything. And then in 5 years, whatever, we'll be back in the same place, having the same conversation.
Okay, now I'm going to group 2 questions because it's 2 questions regarding the government and how it's treating the pandemic in Brazil. Nelson Vasconcelos from the Catholic University of Brasilia says, President Bolsonaro opted for a speech that puts the economic issue in a monetarist perspective as a priority at the expense of the health issue. I would like to hear your point about this and what the likely consequences of these political choices will be for Brazil and its international partners. And because we read this from Nelson Vasconcelos, we also have Leonardo Carvalho from FGV, who says that in the current political situation, where we are dealing with crisis, we have to work with instead of attacking the president. How do you see, what do you think business and ourselves, what are your recommendations for politics and companies to reinvent themselves through crisis?
Boy, the first one is I think is more manageable. I mean, we're faced with the same thing in the U.S. You make this choice between, it's a question of how much risk, health risk, you're willing to assume in exchange for how much economic benefit. I think so. Both President Bolsonaro and President Trump have been opting for the economic benefits, and been willing to have people accept the health risk. Yeah, but it's a trade-off. The more we open the economy, everything else being equal, the greater the problems are going to be with health. So it's a pure and simple trade-off. Now, the second question, again, I'm not sure I'm prepared to answer how businesses are going to do, and how they cope with COVID, how they cope with the current regime. So much of it depends upon sector. So if your business is running restaurants or the tourism, you're in deep trouble. If you're in the healthcare business, you're in good shape. So I think you have to deal with it sector by sector, and that's all I'm going to say.
Thank you very much. I think we've got to, our time is finished. We don't want to take more than your time than you already gave to us. We are very, very happy with your presentation and with the answers of our questions. I want to be sorry for the ones I couldn't read, and to thank the audience for the presence, and tell Professor Guy Peters that our doors here in FGV Brasilia are open. As long as we have a vaccine, we want you here in person.
Okay. Well, thank you. It was very interesting, very enjoyable, and I appreciate being asked. So hope to see you soon in person.
Yes, we do too. Professor Fernando wants to say goodbye too.
Guy, thank you so much. Is welcome to FGV school in Brasilia, and thank you again, and see you in soon.
I hope so. It was my pleasure, Fernando. Hope to see you soon. Okay, take care.
And we want to see the book as well. We are waiting for it.
Okay, everyone stay well.
Okay. Thank you, Professor.
Very much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay.